Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Very good to see an audience here, and the intersection of basically blockchain and DeFi and TradFi. And I'm going to speak specifically about that, right? What is Animoca brands as a consumer brand, as a gaming originated brand? How do we see this convergence, right? So first thing I'm going to talk about is that where are we today, and I'll talk about why we're in a little bit why we're in Hong Kong and how do we see off this converging. Now, in this particular conference, and you see in Hong Kong FinTech Week, if you compare last year to this year, there's a lot of discussion about how do we get away from the native side of Web3 into the traditional institutional side of Web3. That's not articulation that we would like to see, actually, because the innovation actually takes place in the native side, right? And it is good that we see institutional adoption. That is absolutely critical. But the innovation comes from that side. And the intersection of these two is the thesis of what we're talking about. It will merge, right? And at the end of the day, for mass adoption to happen, the real world difference, the users of that, in gaming, in DeFi, in decentralized ID, all of this will need to be adopted massively, right? But these worlds need to converge. Now, let's talk about sort of what native Web3 ultimately is about. I'll give you a slide that you guys all know about, which is premise of ownership, right? Web 1, Web 2 transform ourselves because of the fact that we are able to publish. Again, as a reminder, Web 3 is about the ownership layer. And how is that actually ultimately translating? People, in the midst of sort of speculating crypto assets, actually forgot about one thing that is very important, right? It is really about the philosophy that underpins off what we do, which is about that ownership paradigm. Now, 4 things here, which is what Animoca brands ultimately believe in a lot, is about the network effects. The data that you actually create today, you don't actually own, and you know that from sort of from interacting with Google, Facebook, and all of that, because you get a service in return, you get advertising in return. The communications that happens through advertising, through influencing you, is actually to us an inefficiency. If you actually create your own data and your identities have that layer, the communication actually is much more efficient in that way, right? So by owning that data, you can create network effects, which is part 2, which is sort of like, you can connect these ecosystems together. And in terms of what the implications are, is that in terms of the distribution of the value that is created from data, it's completely different. It's much more fair in a way that it's not about the distribution platform, but it's about the owner and the creators that will actually be rewarded, right? And that's really important because as we go into this age of ownership, and the fact of the matter is that the internet, as it is evolved, the reason Web3 came about in the first place is because of the philosophy of us trusting each other in the first place. And when we go into this ownership paradigm, we want to own that piece of network effect so you can monetize yourself. And by empowering that ownership, you actually get that creativity, right? You get that, you reward creators in a way that allows us to have a much better way of crafting the next wave of internet, right? And then, of course, what we want to get to, rather than sort of company-owned platforms, we want to get to the point where it's community-owned platforms, right? Now, we also go in a little bit into sort of what we talk about in different forms of capital, right? And this is often, we believe, ignored in a lot of ways. We want to look at Web3 as sort of a new form of economic capital that allows people to maybe create wealth, allow people to participate in something that is very new. But it's more than that, right? There's also social, cultural, and symbolic capital that we actually need to look at, right? If you just look at Web3 in terms of just cultural capital, it is really not just economic capital that we actually collectively care about, right? It is about where you have been as a person, right? Your accents, your university degree, right? Your etiquette, whether you own art, what your tastes are, right? All of this is part of your persona that you already display in your social media profile, right? And this matters a lot because that itself is actually monetizable. And your profile matters a lot to you. I would argue that your profile for someone like yourselves in the audience matter as much to you as what your bank account says, right? And this form of capital can now be priced under Web3, right? Now, if you look at sort of what we're doing about this is that so this slide first, which is Mocaverse. We're trying to tie our 550 companies together in our portfolio under this reputation system, which is, again, a decentralized ID under what we call Mocha ID, which you interact with the rest of the internet in the blockchain space to accrue reputation by interacting with different protocols, by farming your airdrops, whether you sell, whether you stake, whether you participate in DAOs, all part of that reputation system that you accrue over time. That becomes something that you can use via gamer ID or a ID associated with NBA team and whatnot. Then in turn, what then happens is that those companies that want to attract you will give you benefits for that, and that is a much more direct way of interacting with companies and the ecosystem that we see today than the present Web2 construct. Now, if you look at sort of EDU and what a token is, EDU is our decentralized education protocol. And what we ultimately believe is that there are ways to transform education via reputation as well. Now, a token ultimately is successful if the network effects can be derived from a token that is launched, which is a Binance-listed token here. And each token represents an entrepreneurial, a unit of entrepreneurialism that is contributing to network effects of what we see today, right? And by putting your education credentials, by interacting with different protocols, and we're building L3 for this, different dApps that you have, you accrue reputation of who you are as a learner, as a profile, as a professional, and therefore you accrue benefits from that. Now, what we do ultimately is that we have, again, 500 companies in our portfolio, and we're trying to build network effects via the ecosystem that we're building, because we believe that our role is to build the ecosystem. And by putting the portfolio together, that interaction via Mocha ID, via Open Campus ID, et cetera, we can tie that ecosystem together and create that network effect. Now, in terms of, again, native Web3 companies, there are a lot of example leaders. And again, this is what ultimately this conference is about. And these layers, these developers, these innovators, is actually what matters in bringing institutional Web3 into light, right? These are innovators. As again, I can't emphasize enough when we talk to government officials here that native Web3 is tremendously important. So therefore, let's not talk about, Web3 is much more than Bitcoin and whatnot. The innovation that has to be brought into Hong Kong, into Greater China, that spurs the institutional adoption must come from the native space, right? And you can see sort of like, some companies that we invest into, many of those you know about network and scaling solutions, financial services, other services, et cetera, right? Now, let's talk about institutional Web3, which is, partially what this conference is ultimately about, is really about institutional adoption, right? As we all know, there are lots of institutions going into Web3 via the ETF, right? This has happened. It's in the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Hong Kong has launched those as well. And institutional adoption is just a macro trend that we see. And if you look at just this year alone, right, last 12 months, right, asset performance, again, we talk about, and this is of course dated now, BTC is near all-time highs already. You look at sort of people talking about gold, talking about uncertainties, macro uncertainty. You see the asset performance in relative terms, even in the last 12 months, even though crypto has gone through its ups and downs, BTC still outperformed. Now, at the end of the day, what you would see is that the more macro uncertainties there are, and the more less of low trust, and more we're going towards sort of like interest cut environment, the more you see these crypto assets being held, right? And as a diversification into an uncertain world, especially with geopolitics, the more you see this particular asset class being taken up by institution, right? And of course, macro, in terms of interest rate cut cycle, no matter who wins the election, there's more regulatory clarity, we believe. And given sort of what we're forecasting in terms of interest rate, you can say that this is the speed of the Fed actually going to cut it as fast as we're going to see it. It doesn't matter. The macro trend is that interest rates are actually going to be reduced, right? And if you look at sort of what Poly Markets is doing, you can say that the polls are actually pretty neck to neck between Trump and Harris. But if you look at sort of what the crypto markets are telling you in Poly Market, there's a lot of sort of, shall we say, a bet that things will be better. So it's a bullish signal rather than sort of like, I'm not saying anyone should participate in this kind of, should we take one side or another, but it's just a signal that people believe that regulatory clarity and the macro will be better. And in terms of sort of asset allocation, again, if you go for surveys, you will see that there is a lot of sentiment about institutions looking at this asset class as a positively. And in terms of just diversification, again, you have huge, you have trillions of dollars locked in traditional assets, right? Again, just 0.1% of that asset being allocated to this market is already huge inflows, right? And it always comes into the form of BTC, Ethereum, and then it goes into the other alts, right? And as applications and users actually being accrued over time, and rest be assured, this will happen, right? We're in the early stage of Web3 and consumer applications. It will happen. And as that amass, then these projects also take off in terms of its valuation. Now, if you look at sort of like the applications that we do see fundamental to even Hong Kong, there are different industries that blockchain can transform. Financial services, very obviously, right, via stable coins, cross-border payments. We're talking about CBDCs, which some people are against. But at the end of the day, you can understand the inefficiency in a non-24/7, expensive correspondent banking kind of a construct versus what blockchain construct is. Consumer retail and tourism via sort of like loyalty, blockchain-based loyalty, via decentralized ID, tons of possibility. It's really about building what this conference is ultimately about, build an infrastructure layer to actually enable this, right? And it will come. Right, just again, some of these names I think, again, you guys will be familiar with. But if we just talk about the financial system, and we're in Hong Kong, and why we're here in the first place is that it is absolutely critical that this domicile, again, is geopolitically, it's under a little bit of an attack about financial center and where it's going to be. We are actually utilizing a SWIFT system, right? And it is quite dominant, and the US dollar is actually weaponized. What we want to move to, ultimately, is a public blockchain, right? But because of KYC concerns, because of the fact that zero-knowledge proofs are still not recognized as there's no global standard for it, we're moving towards the bank-based model, which is a permission blockchain. But ultimately, if you go into permission private blockchain, you're working with CBDCs, tokenized deposits, et cetera, and it's trapped there because it can't interact with the outer layer of public blockchain. But again, we believe you start with stable coins, right? And then you use privately issued stable coins as a way to make sure that the banking system can be much more efficient. Again, if you were to ask me whether the transformation comes from existing banks, or actually really innovative other kinds of financial institutions, I'll place a bet on the latter. Right? I think the innovation will come from native and complete fresh starts. Right? Just like how every industry has been transformed by new players rather than incumbent players. Right? Again, if you look at consumer retail and tourism, ticketing, why do we use QR codes rather than NFT ticketing in the future, loyalty, decentralized identity, et cetera. Okay, so again, Hong Kong has announced like 2 years ago that it's going into the Web3 space, and there are great opportunities there. But you can see, again, across different verticals, Hong Kong has that space, except that my key point about talking to officials is that let's not be scared from 1 or 2 scandals that you see and scams, and then you sort of everything stops. It's like, oh, it's not about Hong Kong, it's not about native Web3. It is so important to have you guys here, right, from overseas, many of you, to build that ecosystem so that this can thrive. Without that native ecosystem that was brought in, without that creativity, there's no way that we will actually get to see the TradFi or the institutional part to work. Basically, I'll wrap up by saying that Animoca Brands has really we've transformed ourselves as well. We originally came up with the sort of asset management investment, 500 companies or so. But we also now do advisory, meaning that we bring these token ecosystems to market. We built our own native ecosystem. The Sandbox is one of them. We're building Open Campus, Mochaverse, our decentralized ID layer. And we're also working with Standard Chartered and Hong Kong Telecom on stablecoin, on a regulated stablecoin. So we do play in both native and institutional space. We do work with other governments like NEOM. We're trying to work with them on an infrastructure layer that governs the AI layer of how they envision the city. And again, finally, just again repeating my message is that we can't just go for institutional Web3 without the native side. Wishing you a good day. Thank you very much.